Every morning he buries his hands in the same cold clay. Perfection arrives on cue. The feeling does not. A bargain is offered, a price whispered. He becomes a master again, with an empty hand. Echoes of the Library presents The Sculptor's Empty Hand, a story from the Unpaid Debt.
Part 1. The Hollow Artist. The morning ritual began not with a thought, but with a weight. Jean-Pierre's hands sank into the cool, damp slab of clay, and the material yielded with a familiar, sibilant sigh. His fingers, caked with the ghosts of yesterday's work, moved with a precision that had long ago divorced itself from his mind. They were the hands of a master craftsman, or perhaps a factory worker on an assembly line that produced only one thing. He could feel the familiar pull in his shoulders and the dull ache in his lower back, the body's monotonous protest against its repetitive labor. Sometimes he sculpted with his eyes closed, a desperate gambit to feel something different, only to open them and find the same soulless perfection staring back. Today, he watched his hands work with a profound sense of detachment, as if they belonged to a stranger he was condemned to observe. He watched them expertly elongate a limb, stretching it beyond natural proportions until it conveyed a uniquely elegant despair. He felt no spark of artistic intent, only the dull recognition of a step in a well-rehearsed and profitable formula, the Devours style.
His gaze drifted from his work, snagging on an object on a cluttered table across the room. It was a small, tarnished silver trophy, a prize from a prestigious competition nearly 20 years ago. A fine layer of gray studio dust coated its surface like a funeral shroud. On autopilot, he walked over, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His fingers left clean, silver streaks as he idly wiped the grime away. The simple touch sprung a trap in his memory. Suddenly, he was there again, the flashback sharp and sensory, the blinding volley of camera flashes, the dizzying clink of champagne glasses, the unexpected weight of the trophy in his hand. He could recall the exact words of a famous critic, his voice heavy with importance, calling his work a defining statement for a new generation. He remembered the feeling of his heart hammering against his ribs with a joy so fierce and pure, it was like swallowing light.
And then, just as quickly, the vision evaporated. He was back in his silent studio, the tarnished trophy cool and dead in his palm. The memory was a perfect, sterile hologram. He could access the data, the sights, the sounds, the sequence of events, but the emotional core had been expertly excised. It was like reading a rapturous description of a magnificent meal. He knew it had been good, but he could not taste it. The chasm between the memory and the feeling left him colder than before. A jarring buzz from the workbench sliced through the silence. His phone. He saw the name, Elise, and her bright, smiling face lit up the small screen. Before he could react, the image triggered a more recent, more painful memory. Elise's last visit, a month ago. She had stood in this very studio, a splash of vibrant life against a backdrop of gray. She'd brought him pastries from her favorite boulangerie, her voice full of energy as she talked about her classes at the Sorbonne. He remembered looking at her, this wonderful person he loved more than life itself, and feeling a terrifying, echoing blankness inside himself. He had nodded and smiled, playing the part of the proud father, but his responses were hollow, and he knew she could feel it. He would never forget the way her hopeful expression had slowly faded throughout the afternoon, replaced by a polite, wounded disappointment. Now, as her picture glowed on the phone, the thought of answering and putting her through that charade again was unbearable. Protecting her from his own encroaching emptiness felt like the only authentic act of love he was still capable of performing. With a deep, shuddering breath, he silenced the call, his thumb pressing down on the screen as if to extinguish a flame. The guilt settled not in his mind, but in his stomach, a hard physical weight. A surge of self-loathing, hot and sharp, propelled him into motion. He turned from his signature piece, a monument to his creative damnation. This would be the day it changed. He grabbed a fresh block of clay, slamming it onto a different, smaller stand with a wet thud. He would fight the formula. He would break the spell. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure a different form, a face contorted in laughter, a body curled in peaceful repose, anything but the stretched, silent despair of his brand. He thought of Elise's vibrant smile. He would sculpt that. He attacked the clay with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years, his knuckles white. The initial moments were a chaotic, thrilling struggle. This was it. This was creating. But then his hands, those two old traitors, began their subtle sabotage. A finger smoothed a curve he had meant to leave sharp. A thumb pressed an indentation that began to form a familiar, hollow cheekbone. Inexorable pull from his wrists and forearms began to elongate the neck. He was not just failing to create something new. He felt a physical resistance, a deep wrongness in his own muscles as they fought against his will. His hands had their own agenda. They were not his. They were fighting him, and they were winning. He stopped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared at what he had done. On the stand was not Elise's smile, but the nascent, monstrous form of another signature Dubois. The rebellion was over. It was lost before it had even begun. A wave of despair so profound it was nauseating washed over him. He didn't have the energy to smash this one. He simply stepped back, his shoulders slumping in utter defeat. His gaze swept across the studio, and he saw it for what it truly was, a tomb. He was not the artist here. He was the principal exhibit, a man perpetually embalmed in the moment of his single infernal idea. It was in this pit of absolute surrender that the first impossible detail emerged: a scent. It cut through the stale, earthy air of clay and dust with the precision of a scalpel. It was not a smell that belonged here. It was rich, complex, and utterly alien. Black cherries, damp earth after a rain, a hint of old leather and dried roses. It was a living, breathing aroma in a dead space. It was the scent of a very old, very expensive Burgundy. Jean-Pierre's head lifted slowly. His despair was momentarily eclipsed by a primal, confused alarm. The scent was a violation, an inexplicable intrusion into his sealed world.
He scanned the deep shadows between his silent sculptures, his heart beginning a low, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. The miserable rules of his reality were beginning to fray at the edges.
Part 2: Demonic Arrival and Revelation. Following the impossible scent, Jean-Pierre's eyes scanned the gloom, landing on the room's sole guest chair. The rickety wooden thing, usually a throne for dusty rags and discarded tools, was occupied. The sight was so wrong, so profoundly incongruous, it felt like a deliberate tear in the fabric of his world. A man was sitting there, and he was immaculate. He wore a charcoal suit that seemed to actively repel the studio's oppressive grime, the fine wool holding a perfect press. He held a stemmed glass, swirling a deep crimson liquid with a steady, practiced hand. His posture was one of absolute ownership, a relaxed entitlement that instantly reframed the room. In his presence, it was Jean-Pierre who was the intruder. The man looked up, and his voice was the first thing to truly disarm him. It was smooth, cultured, and laced with a confident amusement that put Jean-Pierre immediately on the defensive. "Apologies," the man said, his voice a low melody. "I find a good Burgundy helps one appreciate the more melancholic forms of art. And you, monsieur, are a master of the form."
"Who are you?" Jean-Pierre demanded, his own voice sounding rough and weak in comparison. "How did you get in here?" The man gave a small, dismissive wave. The how is tedious, full of paperwork and obscure bylaws you wouldn't understand. As for the who, Bartholomew Thorne. He offered the name as if it were a gift. A consultant, you might say, and a great admirer. He rose, his movements impossibly silent on the gritty concrete. "I'm not interested in selling today," Jean-Pierre said curtly, a pathetic attempt to regain control. Barty's smile didn't falter. "Selling? Oh no, I'm here about your acquisition." His eyes glinted with a dark mirth. "It's the origin story that fascinates me." He took a delicate sip of wine. "I've always wondered what it must have felt like as a young man to hear your own tutor, what was his name? Professor Alary, describe your most passionate work as hopelessly derivative." The name, the exact quote. It was a psychological atom bomb detonating in the silent studio. Jean-Pierre felt the blood drain from his face. The man wasn't a madman or a prankster. He was something else, something impossible. Seizing the advantage, Barty began to glide through the studio, no longer a guest, but a curator narrating an exhibit of Jean-Pierre's life. He gestured with his wineglass toward a forgotten, failed sculpture in a dark corner. "Ah yes, this was before the breakthrough, wasn't it? Still wrestling with other people's ideas. So much passion, so little vision." He moved to one of the signature pieces, trailing his fingers through the air just above its surface. And then the great leap forward. The morning after that dreadful night in the garret, I believe. He didn't guess, he stated. He narrated the details of that night, the specific, biting chill in the air, the sour, metallic taste of the cheap wine,
the suffocating feeling of utter hopelessness, with the unnerving accuracy of an eyewitness. Jean-Pierre's denials, which had risen to his throat, died there, devolving into whispered, choked fragments. "No, how could you?" Barty stopped directly in front of him, his charming facade peeling back to reveal something cold and ancient beneath. He was no longer narrating, he was accusing. "You stood at that tiny window, looking out at a city that didn't know or care that you existed, and you screamed a wish into the dark." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping, compelling Jean-Pierre to relive the shame. A wish for a style, a unique, unmistakable style that would ensure your name would be remembered forever. He paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing Jean-Pierre to feel the weight of that desperate, pathetic moment. "And then return," Barty continued, his voice now a bare whisper that coiled in the air between them. "You offered anything." The word hung there, heavy and undeniable, a promissory note written in despair. Jean-Pierre's last defense mechanism was to grasp for the mundane. "You're insane," he breathed. "A performer." Barty offered a small, pitying smile. "Sanity is a matter of perspective. I prefer to think of myself as a records keeper." He reached into the inner pocket of his immaculate suit and produced a slim folio bound in what looked like dark, supple leather. It didn't glow or smoke. It looked like an absurdly high-end legal document, which was somehow more terrifying. He didn't open it. He simply tapped a manicured finger on its cover. "Account number 77-492, he recited, his tone dry and chillingly bureaucratic. The specificity of it, the numbers, the letter, was what finally shattered Jean-Pierre's disbelief. This wasn't a curse from a fairy tale. This was a file, a case number in some vast, infernal bureaucracy. Looking at the broken artist before him, Barty delivered the final, crushing explanation. His voice was devoid of malice now, replaced by the simple, inexorable tone of a clerk stating terms and conditions. The wish, as stipulated, was granted the very next morning. A sudden, glorious inspiration. He gestured to the silent sculptures surrounding them. The payment, however, was structured as an installment plan, far more manageable. We find it leads to less default. He met Jean-Pierre's horrified gaze, the predator revealing the nature of the trap long after it had sprung. We've been collecting, piece by piece, the one commodity you had in such abundance back then, the one thing you so generously pledged. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, delivering the final line like a death sentence. We've been collecting your joy. Part 3. The terror that had seized Jean-Pierre began to curdle, solidifying into a hard, brittle anger. It was the last defense of a cynical mind, a shield forged in years of disappointment. He let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass in the studio's oppressive silence. He would reframe this, shrink this impossible man down to a manageable size. "Is that what this is?" he sneered, forcing a contemptuous curl onto his lips. He gestured vaguely around the room, at the sheets and the dust. "Some kind of avant-garde performance art?
a meticulously cruel prank to torment a washed-up artist. He reached for his workbench, and his hand closed around a heavy boxwood modeling tool. He held it not as a weapon, but as a pathetic scepter of his own domain. "Congratulations, your monologue was chilling. Your costume is impeccable. Now get out of my studio before I call the gendarmes. I'm sure they'd be fascinated by your little leather folio." Barty's smile did not waver, but it seemed to lose all its manufactured warmth, becoming a fixed, painted thing. "Performance art? No, Jean-Pierre. This is simply bookkeeping." He did not move toward the sculpture. He didn't need to. He simply raised his free hand, the one not holding the wine, and made a small, almost dismissive gesture in the air. For a horrifying second, nothing happened. Then the clay figure on the stand convulsed. It wasn't a slump or a sag. It was a violent, unnatural movement. The elegant, elongated limbs began to retract, thickening and shortening as if being rewound by an unseen force. The impossibly long neck shrank, the head sinking down into a clumsy, brutish torso. The smooth, featureless face, the very hallmark of his style, began to bubble and pucker. Crude suggestions of eyes and a gaping mouth pushed outward from within, twisting the face into a lumpen, amateurish parody. The entire piece was devolving, regressing from a celebrated Dubois into the passionate, derivative garbage he had created on the very night he had screamed his wish into the dark. To compound the horror, the air grew thick with the phantom scent of cheap, sour wine and the unmistakable, damp chill of a freezing garret. The modeling tool clattered from Jean-Pierre's nerveless fingers, striking the concrete floor with a sharp crack. The strength evaporated from his legs, and he stumbled backward, his hands slapping against a dusty workbench to keep him from collapsing. The proof was absolute, undeniable. It shattered the very foundation of his life, not with a sledgehammer, but with a quiet, irrefutable correction in a ledger. His mind, which he had always considered his sharpest tool, became a frantic, horrifying account book, its pages flipping wildly as it connected 2.5 decades of disparate events with a single, damning thread of logic. The miraculous inspiration the next morning. The first gallery owner who saw genius where his tutor saw failure. The slow, creeping numbness he had misdiagnosed as artistic burnout. The frustrating, infuriating way his own hands seemed to fight him every time he tried to sculpt something new, something different, always defaulting back to the familiar, profitable lines. The awards, the fame, the money, they weren't accolades, they were receipts. He looked down at his own hands, truly seeing them for the first time, not as extensions of his will, but as collateral, leased assets. They did not belong to him. Observing Jean-Pierre's silent collapse with the cool detachment of a biologist watching a specimen, Barty's entire demeanor shifted. The menace receded, replaced by an unnerving air of professional concern. He set his wine glass down on a miraculously clean spot on the table and sat back in the chair, crossing his legs. His posture was that of a financial advisor about to discuss a problematic portfolio. Now, he said, his voice softening. There's no need for panic. Think of me as being from quality control. We've been monitoring your account, and frankly, the returns are diminishing." He gestured at the ruined clay figure, which had now settled into a pathetic, lumpy stillness. "Your joy, the primary asset backing this agreement, is nearly depleted. From a purely administrative standpoint, your soul is becoming bland. It's an accounting headache for everyone involved." Barty leaned forward, his voice dropping into a seductive, conspiratorial tone. He was no longer an enforcer, but a salesman offering the deal of a lifetime. "But what if I told you we could fix this? This isn't a collection, Jean-Pierre. It's an opportunity, an account review. We can restore it, a full refund." He painted a picture so vivid, so irresistible, it was a physical pain to hear. Imagine it, the fire in your gut when you see a block of raw clay. The thrill of an idea so powerful it keeps you awake at night, pacing this very floor. The sheer, unadulterated rush of creation, of feeling the art flow through you, not just from you. We can give you that back. The artist you were, with the fame you have now. Jean-Pierre stared at the shapeless mess of clay, the grave of his lie. A flicker of his old defiance sparked. "And if I say no?" he whispered, his voice raw. "If I tell you to go to hell?" Barty chuckled, a dry, humorless sound like rustling paper. "But Jean-Pierre, I'm already there, and so, in a way, are you." His voice hardened just a fraction, a razor's edge beneath the velvet. "If you refuse, the original terms stand. The installment plan continues. We will collect the remaining slivers of your joy. Then we'll move on to adjacent assets. Nostalgia, ambition, hope. You will become a true automaton, a biological machine repeating a function until there is nothing left to harvest. At which point, the account is declared in default and will be liquidated. I assure you, the methods for liquidation are far less pleasant than this conversation." The threat so calmly delivered slammed the door on any notion of refusal. This wasn't a trap, it was a lifeline, a toxic, monstrous lifeline, but the only one being offered. The vision Barty had painted, of feeling again, of creating again, was too powerful to resist. He was broken, desperate, and completely, utterly ensnared. He looked up from his alien hands, his face a mask of anguish and longing. The power dynamic had irrevocably inverted. He was no longer a victim. He was a desperate customer begging for terms. "What do you want?" he asked, the words tearing from his throat. "What is the price for getting it back?" A slow, triumphant smile spread across Barty's lips, the first genuine expression Jean-Pierre had seen on him. He had won. The question itself was the signature on the dotted line. "Balance," Barty said softly, savoring the word. "The books must always be balanced. It requires a simple collateral swap, a payment of equivalent emotional weight to close out your account permanently." He spread his hands in a gesture of magnanimous finality, a one-time lump sum payment, neat, tidy, final. Part 4. Fulfillment and Consequence. Having asked the price, Jean-Pierre braced himself, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. In the smoldering ruins of his reality, a desperate, foolish hope flickered. He imagined the cost would be something he could bear, something physical or abstract. He could offer a memory of his childhood, a phantom limb he could learn to live without. He would part with his sense of taste, a small price for a feast of the soul. He would even offer up a hand. The irony would be cruel for a sculptor, but he could learn to work with the other. He was a man prepared to sign away an asset, to pay a pound of flesh, to reclaim the one thing he now knew he could not live without, his soul's fire. He looked at Barty with the pleading eyes of a debtor begging for a survivable sentence. Barty let the silence stretch, savoring the moment of absolute power. He did not state the price immediately. He framed it with a chilling corporate logic that made it sound both reasonable and monstrous. The asset you wish to reclaim, your joy, your creative passion, is intrinsically tied to your capacity for profound emotional connection. A powerful input requires a powerful output. Therefore, the collateral for its return must be of equivalent value, a memory of equal emotional weight. He paused, his dark eyes watching Jean-Pierre's face for the slightest flicker of understanding. Not your memory of your parents, they're long gone. The account is emotionally dormant. Not your memory of your own ambition, that's already heavily mortgaged. He leaned forward then, his voice dropping to a soft, intimate whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. Her name is Elise. For a moment, the name was just a sound. Jean-Pierre didn't understand. Then the meaning landed, not as a thought, but as a physical blow. A guttural sound tore from his throat, and he recoiled, stumbling back as if he'd been struck. "No," he whispered, the word sharp with disbelief. Then louder, fiercer, "Absolutely not." It was a line drawn in the dust of his shattered life, a border he would not cross. His love for Elise, however muted and distant it now felt, was the last sacred thing he possessed. "You're a monster," he snarled, a flash of his old passionate self returning with a vengeance. To even suggest it, it's not possible. The deal is off. He felt a strange, giddy relief in his own outrage. The price was so obscene, so unthinkable, that it had made the choice for him. It was an escape clause written in pure horror. Barty remained perfectly calm, utterly unfazed by the outburst. He simply tilted his head, a gesture of mild curiosity. "A monster?" he asked. "I am merely a banker pointing out your most valuable, liquid asset. Consider the reality of your situation. You are a ghost to her already, are you not? You give her your silence, your guilt, this hollowed-out version of a father." He gestured around the tomb-like studio. "With this deal, you would have something to give to the world. Masterpieces, beauty born from a fire she will never witness, but that will outlive you both. What is the greater legacy, Jean-Pierre? A hollow love that brings her only pain, or a towering body of work that brings humanity awe?" He was framing the monstrous choice as a noble, artistic sacrifice. Before Jean-Pierre could find the breath to argue, Barty pressed his second, more insidious point. His voice became sinfully gentle, as if offering a genuine mercy. "You say you love her, but what is the quality of that love now? It's a memory you can't feel, an obligation that brings you pain. You see her, and you feel your own emptiness reflected back. You hurt her with your distance. He paused, letting the truth of the statement settle. This way, she simply becomes a stranger, a young woman who occasionally calls the wrong number. You will be polite. You will feel nothing. And she, Barty's eyes glinted, she will eventually be free of the ghost of a father who cannot love her back. In its own way, it is a profound act of kindness. You are not destroying a relationship. You are cauterizing a wound. Jean-Pierre was reeling, his moral compass spinning wildly in the storm of Barty's logic. The arguments were of venom, seeping into the cracks of his despair. He looked at the lump of dead clay on its stand. He envisioned the alternative, 30 more years of this gray silence, this living death, until he was nothing but dust in a dusty room. The phantom limb pain of his lost joy was an excruciating, ever-present ache. As he stared at his empty hands, Barty made his final move. He subtly raised a finger, and for a single, breathtaking second, Jean-Pierre felt it. A jolt of pure, white-hot inspiration, so powerful it buckled his knees. He saw the clay not as mud, but as infinite possibility. A dozen new forms, brilliant, dynamic, and alive, exploded in his mind's eye. He felt the phantom thrill of the tool in his hand, the ecstatic yielding of the material to his will. The feeling was so overwhelming, so ecstatically real, that it dwarfed any memory of love he could currently access. It was life. It was fire. And then, just as quickly, Barty lowered his finger and snatched it away. The gray silence crashed back in, more profound and terrible than before. He was left gasping, his heart hammering, stranded on the shore of his own desolate reality. That single stolen second was what broke him. It was the addict, deep in the agony of withdrawal, being offered a single, perfect dose. He looked at Barty, his face a ruin of conflict and desperate, selfish longing. He was choosing to feel again. He was choosing himself. He was committing the same sin he had committed as a young man, but this time with his eyes wide open to the unspeakable cost. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a terrible, soul-crushing resolve. His throat was dry. His voice, when it came, was a faint, rasping whisper, the sound of a soul tearing in two. Do it. Part 5. Resolution. The words, "do it," hung in the still, heavy air of the studio, a final, irrevocable signature on an unseen contract. Barty's lips curled into a smile of pure, professional satisfaction. It was not the triumphant grin of a demon savoring a soul, but the quiet, deep contentment of a banker closing a major acquisition after a long and complex negotiation. He gave a single, crisp nod of confirmation. The elegant leather folio in his hand did not vanish in a dramatic puff of smoke. Instead, it behaved like a photograph burning from the inside out. Its edges blurred, growing thin and translucent, before dissolving inward into a wisp of nothingness. The air shimmered for a moment, leaving behind only the faint, sharp scent of ozone and old, dry paper. Barty smoothed the front of his suit jacket, his work here complete. "Pleasure doing business with you, monsieur," he said softly,
his voice once again the smooth, charming melody from his arrival. "We value your account." He turned and walked not towards the door, but towards the deepest shadows at the edge of the studio. He didn't exit, he was simply absorbed by the gloom, and then he was gone.
Jean-Pierre barely registered his departure. The moment the folio had dissolved, a profound and violent change had begun within him. It started as an Arctic shock, a freezing wave that rushed through him, feeling as if it were scouring decades of gray dust from the inside of his soul. Then, a fire ignited in his chest. A deep, invigorating warmth spread through his veins, electric and powerfully alive. The world, which had been a muted, miserable watercolor for 25 years, exploded into saturated color. The grime on the window pane was no longer a film of dirt, but a complex tapestry of ochre and umber and sienna. The dust motes in the air were no longer symbols of decay, but a swarm of dancing, golden sparks in the light. He could hear the distant sounds of Paris again, not as an irritating drone, but as a vibrant symphony of life. The low rumble of the metro, the clear chime of a distant bell, the musical murmur of traffic. It was a full-body, sensory resurrection. He looked around his studio with new eyes. The half-finished signature piece was no longer a monument to his failure, but a fascinating study in form, a beautiful, stark starting point for a dozen new, radical ideas. The lump of ruined clay he had smashed in frustration now looked like a miniature mountain range waiting to be carved, full of thrilling peaks and valleys. His mind, once a silent, empty chamber, was now a roaring furnace of inspiration. A torrent of images, forms, and compositions flooded him, so fast and so powerful it made him dizzy with exhilaration. He felt an urgent physical need to work, a hunger to feel the clay yield beneath his fingers. It wasn't just inspiration, it was a ravenous craving. He was alive. As he reached for the clay, his hands trembling with eagerness, the phone on the table buzzed again. The sound was the same as before, but his reaction was completely different. It was a crude annoyance, an unwelcome interruption to the symphony in his head. He glanced impatiently at the screen. The name Elise was there, beneath a picture of a smiling young woman he did not recognize. The name was just a word, a collection of letters without context or connection. He felt no guilt, no love, not even the faintest flicker of a memory. There was only a mild, detached curiosity as to why a stranger would be calling him. The emotional void where his daughter used to be was so complete, so absolute, he didn't even notice it was there. To silence the noise so he to begin his masterpiece, he snatched up the phone. "Oui, allô?" His voice was not the weary rasp of an hour ago. It was clear, energized, and vibrant with confidence. He listened for a moment to the cheerful, feminine voice on the other end, his expression polite but blank, his mind already back on the glorious shapes he wanted to create. He held the phone slightly away from his ear, a frown of impatience touching his brow. He cut her off mid-sentence. "Pardon, madame," he said, his tone friendly but utterly final. "I believe you have the wrong number." He hung up before she could reply, tossing the phone back onto the table with a dismissive clatter. The action was thoughtless, efficient, and infinitely cruel. The interruption was already forgotten. He turned back to the sculpting stand, his face transfigured. The mask of cynical despair was gone, replaced by a rapturous glow, illuminated from within by the fire he had so dearly bought. He was a man who had found his God again in a lump of mud. Plunging both hands deep into the block of fresh clay, he let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was not a sigh of weariness, but of pure, unadulterated bliss. The material was yielding, alive, and full of infinite promise. He was a complete artist once more, and he had never been more empty.
Thank you for listening to The Sculptor's Empty Hand, part of the Unpaid Debt. Subscribe to Echoes of the Library for more whispered stories.